Hi folks, welcome to the video. This video corresponds with notes 3.2 on political ideology. So I know we've talked about ideology before, but we haven't really gotten into some specifics yet. So our goal for today's video is to describe the ideological spectrum that we see people subscribe to, both on the left and the right. So, we have talked about ideology before in the last video when we were talking about American values and socialization. But just remember that an ideology is a comprehensive, meaning it spans a wide range of issues, economic and social, and mutually consistent set of beliefs about what the government should and should not do. And we see this as a spectrum or a range, as we will talk about. Most of the time, describing someone as belonging to an ideology is oversimplifying this spectrum, but it's the best way that we can describe what it is that people believe when we look at political beliefs. So, when we're talking about ideology, something important to note is that ideologies will guide us often to political parties, but like I was saying, it's very, very, very rare that you will find someone that holds all liberal ideologies or all conservative ideologies, for example. So, political parties have these ideological positions, and those positions shape the terms of debate on public policy issues, and specifically how the government should approach or fund various issues. So, when we're talking about issues, there are three or really two main types of issues. The very first is a valence issue. And a valence issue, these are concerns or policies that are viewed in the same way by people with a variety of ideologies, meaning there's usually a consensus on um, the issue itself. So, for example, among pretty much all ideologies, we see an agreement that the government should regulate dangerous industries, or the government should um, educate children at public expense, right? That is a pretty common thing that you will see. All ideologies also we'll see to some degree protecting free speech, right? The extent of that is different, the degree to that is different, but there is an agreement among ideologies that civil liberty should be protected. Valence issues are not the issues that are often talked about in debates and in political conversation because there's an agreement. Where we see the debate and the disagreement are the wedge issues. And wedge issues sharply divide the public, and that's the reason why they're usually talked about. With wedge issues, there's little room for acceptance of competing ideas because each ideology considers their opinion right and the other side wrong. And this is where we've seen that sharp divide between ideologies and the political parties that subscribe to them. So, examples of wedge issues. I know that you can probably think of many more, but abortion, right? Whether you are pro choice or pro life, that is a huge divide that we see between the two main ideologies that we'll talk about. Um, One that has kind of taken a step back in recent years, but back in the early and mid 2000s, invasion and occupation of Iraq right after 9/11, that was a wedge and still arguably is a wedge issue, right? Should we or should we have not invaded and occupied Iraq for the war on terror? Now, saliency means that an issue has an intense importance to an individual or group. And usually we say that these wedge issues are more salient or have more saliency than the valence issues, for example. So when we're looking at saliency, right, senior citizens, that group, that demographic, might have or hold, and arguably do hold, reform of Social Security as having more salience or importance than 18 to 20-year-olds. Now, on the flip side, 18 to 20-year-olds, their salient issues might be the lack of job opportunities because they have a higher unemployment rate than older age groups. So the saliency, the range of importance on especially wedge issues is going to vary depending on the individual or group. Now, when we're looking at ideology in our country, we typically describe it as a liberal or conservative spectrum, or the liberal to conservative spectrum. And political scientists use terms like liberal and conservative, liberal, left, conservative, right, to label each end of the ideological spectrum, which, like I've said before, is a range. Now, I think it's important to note that most Americans are moderate, not extreme, partisan, or radical. You'll hear in the news talking about things like the alt right or the radical left, right? As we're using those terms to describe the spectrum, we're talking about people that are extreme. However, most Americans do not fall into that range. Most Americans have beliefs in both ideologies, and they're not the extreme views of them. So this is the typical liberal conservative spectrum that we see, and I do want to kind of describe a little bit about what these various terms mean. So I want to start out with those extremes: the alt right, the alt left, or the radical left. So as we move outward on our spectrum, folks, you can see that we get a little bit more radical, a little bit more controversial, as you will see. So, on our very, very end, we have fascism on the very, very far right or conservative, and communism on the very, very far left or liberal. Now, it's very interesting because what we see happen is the further left and right you go, at our very extreme ends, we have quite a bit of government regulation, right? With communism and fascism. If you haven't heard that term in a while, that's talking about like, the Nazi Party, for example. Um, we're seeing quite a bit of government regulation, which, as we see on the right, is very, very strange. But these very far right and left ideologies typically have more government or authoritarian, if you will, regulation. Now, let's talk about what it means typically to be conservative or liberal. So, on the right, if we swing a little bit to the right, what we see is that conservatives are typically against unnecessary, wasteful government spending. They often are pro programs and funding the military. So, having a strong national defense is very important for those who are conservative. Um, Conservatives typically want low or little government regulation on economic issues. So, lowering taxes, for example, little regulation of businesses, little government interference. So, this is where we're really seeing that laissez faire idea of the economy that we were talking about when we talked about free enterprise. Conservatives also are pretty much eh, about maintaining cultural traditions as well. So, with conservatism, we usually see that this is more of your pro life, against same sex marriage. Most of the time, those issues fall into the conservative side of the spectrum. Now, those who are conservative are often traditional Christian voters. Like I just said, those who oppose abortion, same sex marriage. Oftentimes, conservatives are more likely, if we're looking at those cultural factors we talked about with socialization, to be men. Older generations, those in the Midwest and in the southern regions of the United States, as well as those who are white. So that is traditionally conservative um, members. And then on the left, like when we're talking about left, we're talking about liberalism. And as we see a trend, those who are more left or liberal advocate for civil rights, women's rights, rights of the accused. Stronger gun control is going to be a huge liberal ideology. More government services. So, whereas conservatism was limited government regulation and involvement, liberalism, we see an increase in the size of government in terms of regulation. So, maybe raising taxes to provide more services to solve public problems, greater regulations to protect the environment, right? And as you get further into the left, we see more government regulation of especially economic issues with socialism and communism as well. Now, those who are liberal tend to be younger. The younger generations typically are more liberal, minorities, women, coastal residents as well. So we saw that in the demographic map, the regions of the United States. Now, I do want to talk about libertarianism a little bit here in terms of the right side of the spectrum. Libertarians are more right or more conservative than traditional conservatives. Um, and libertarianism generally opposes pretty much all government intervention and regulation when it comes to economics. And that's what we mean when we say more right. Um, Libertarians have a high regard for civil liberties, right? They oppose censorship. They're typically conservative on economic issues, right? Lowering taxes, having very, very, very little government involvement, if at all, to interfere with the rights of the individuals. However, libertarians are often more liberal on social and moral issues. So, kind of a weird mix here, but typically libertarians are pro choice and are in favor of same sex marriage. Now, we will dive into exactly what liberalism and conservatism believes more in class, but just so that you have an understanding here, guys, the modern Republican Party holds a conservative party doctrine, and the modern Democratic Party holds a more liberal doctrine. So make sure that you understand conservatism, Republican, liberal, Democratic. Now, one final thing here before we end the video, I do want to talk about what it means to be an independent. An independent is a voter who votes for candidates and issues rather than on the basis of an ideology or partisanship. So they do not subscribe to either ideology or party. And what we see is that there has been a rise or an increase in the number of independents over the years. As the country has unfolded, as we've gotten into the 20th and 21st century, we've seen an increase in the number of voters who identify as independent versus conservative or liberal or one of the more far reaching ideologies. All right, guys, that is it. Remember that our objective was to describe the ideological spectrum. So make sure that you are asking questions in class. If you have them, go back and watch anything if you need to. And I will talk to you guys soon. Bye.